Hey, what's going on? Keith from Trigger Happy. Going to talk about a little different subject, and I'm going to do a series of videos on this where, we're going to talk about prepping, and we're going to talk about all the things that go along with it. And I'm relatively new to the subject, probably been doing it for 6 months to maybe a year. So we're kind of going to learn together. I'm going to share with you some of the things that I have learned, and then, we're going to do this as if we're all brand new to the subject of prepping. So why be a prepper? And that's kind of a term that I'm not a big fan of. But why be prepared? Several reasons. One, we all, if you live in the United States, are concerned about the direction that the country is going. We're all concerned with the economy, the state of our job market, everything. And it's kind of, it's worrisome on a short-term scale. It's worrisome on a long-term scale. What's our country going to be like in 5 years or 15 years? So people have really gotten into this preparedness movement essentially out of necessity, because they are seeing that down the road you may not have a choice. You're either prepared or you're dead. So we'll talk about that in a minute. The other reason is kind of a natural disaster, and or some sort of man-made calamity. In a neighboring state in West Virginia, they had a water shortage that lasted a long time, 2 and 3 weeks, and even as of the filming of this video, they're still dealing with it, where essentially chemicals leaked from an industrial site into the water supply, and about 300,000 people in West Virginia were affected, and they had no water of any kind. You turn it on, it'd run, but you couldn't drink it, you couldn't bathe with it, cook with it, you couldn't do anything with it. And that was pretty serious. West Virginia is a very sparsely populated state, and imagine if that happened in a city like Chicago or Los Angeles or Columbus, Ohio, even a little closer to home. You're talking about millions of people. So in West Virginia, people were driving to neighboring states, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Ohio, so on and so forth, to find food, water, lodging, and all those sorts of things. But again, if it happened on a massive scale, and you had hundreds of thousands or even millions of people affected by some sort of disaster, it's going to be chaos. So you need to be prepared for those sorts of things. The first thing we're going to talk about, and again, this video is really going to talk about very broad ideas before we get into more specific things in upcoming videos. Types of prepping. The government that we all know and love tells us to be prepared for a natural disaster or man-made disaster, they like to call it, i.e. terrorism. But that would go along the lines of the water shortage we just talked about. They suggest you have, I believe, 3 days of food and water and other things on hand. To me, that is not nearly enough. I want to have probably more like a week to 15 days on hand for disaster. And a disaster can be an earthquake, wildfire, water shortage, power outage, hurricane, you name it. In Ohio, and I've mentioned this in another video, we had a power outage that affected a majority of the state, and in some places people were without power for 7 to 15 days. Personally, it was 10 days for us. And you would not believe what happens to people after 2 or 3 days of having no air conditioning, no gas, no food, because they couldn't keep it cold. People, it was insane. Only a few gas stations had power, and lines lasted for hours, if not days, to get just a few gallons of gas. Fortunately, my family was prepared for that, and so I kind of laughed it off. And sadly, my day job is insurance, so it wasn't a great time for that because we had a lot of damage to deal with. But nevertheless, from a preparedness standpoint, we were in pretty good shape. So if you're planning for a disaster, My minimum would be 15 days of everything you need. Short-term prepping is what I would call between 15 and 60 days. And this is probably the category that I'm in right now. Being prepared for 60 days is a long time if you really think about it. Do you have 60 days of medication if you take prescriptions? Do you have 60 days of food? That's a lot of food. Or water. That's a ton of water. So being prepared for 60 days is a pretty large task, and it's a big undertaking. The last one would be long-term prepping, and these are kind of your survivalists. These are your people you see on TV that are preparing for doomsday. You're talking about preparing for a disaster or an economic collapse of the country, the government collapse, whatever. And you're talking about months or years. And this is a huge undertaking and a huge commitment of capital. You are going to spend tens of thousands, if not six figures, on being prepared for a long-term situation. Personally, I don't have the means and I don't have the time to be prepared long-term. So I'm going to focus more on disaster and short-term in the videos that I do, and we'll touch on this subject some in the upcoming videos, but it's really not where I'm going. And for probably 95% of people out there, that's not what they're preparing for either, just due to the next topic we're going to hit tonight, which is budgets. And most people don't have the funds to, do you have an extra $50,000 laying around to put towards prepping? The answer for a large majority of people would be absolutely not. So we're going to make a realistic budget, and we're going to try to stick to that. So in our budget, we need to think of things that we need to acquire, and make a list of those things, and then a time frame on how long we're going to take to acquire these things. Your list will be different depending upon where you are. If you live in the northern states where your climate is cold, you're going to have to take steps to be prepared for that. Whether you are planning on staying put or you are planning on getting out of Dodge. If you're in the south, again, a whole different set of prepping. So, we're just kind of hit some general items. Some things you're going to need to consider. Obviously, food and water are the biggies that everybody knows. And I want to take a practical approach to this, in the way I do things. I don't have the funds to have huge water storage type things. I see these people with hundreds of gallons in these elaborate systems. The tank itself is $1,500, not counting the time it takes to get it set up and all the other things you have to do for it. So we're going to take a practical approach to this kind of stuff, things that you can do easily. Food storage, we're going to talk about food storage and ways that I'm kind of preparing for that, and you're probably going to be a little bit different, but we'll discuss that. Medical, my wife has a condition she had with thyroid cancer, so she has no thyroid. So I have to really take that into account. What are we going to do long term? And again, I'm talking long term is relative, but let's say 60 days. Does she have enough medication for that period of time? And a lot of people are on every kind of drug out there, from antidepressants to high blood pressure medicine, arthritis medicine. And if you deal with some of these things, you know that if you go a couple days without your medication, it can be life-threatening. So that's something we're going to talk about. Obviously, I'm a gun guy, so we're gonna hit on weapons at some point, ammunition storage, where you're finding ammunition these days when it's tough. and some guns you want to look into. We're going to hit outdoor gear, bug out bags. I'm going to hit a lot of things. So I just ask you to stick with me, and we're going to pump these things out. I'm pretty low tech, as obvious you can tell by my lovely whiteboard here. I don't do a lot of video editing and tricks and all kinds of stuff. So it's low tech, and I think you'll like what we're going to do. So stick with us, and we're going to talk about some of this stuff in some upcoming videos. So thanks again. This is Keith from Trigger Happy. We will see you next time.